Okay, today is June 5th, 2010, and we're doing the Ariyapariyesana Sutta Part 4. Okay, we'll begin with homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Good morning, everyone. Okay, we are still in the Ariyapariyesana Sutta, and now we're at page, let me just see. Okay, we're on page 262. The last time we ended the section number 21, and at this point the Buddha makes the decision he accepts the request of Brahma Sahampati, to teach the Dhamma, and so he declares open for them are the doors to the deathless. Let those with ears now show their faith. So now the Buddha has made this commitment to begin teaching. Then Brahma, after receiving this assurance from the Buddha, then Brahma disappears. Okay, so now we're beginning paragraph 22. And so now the Buddha comes to now that he's made the decision to start teaching, he faces the question, to whom should I first teach the Dhamma? And then this is followed by the other question, next question, who will understand this Dhamma quickly? See, Buddha is very modern, he wants quick results. Okay, and so in a way this is going to be a momentous historical event that's lying just ahead. But now the Buddha is the one who's reached the supreme enlightenment, and he's recognized that other people, other beings have this capacity for enlightenment. They're like lotus flowers in different stages of growth. And there are some lotus flowers that are just on the surface of the water, just waiting for the sun to rise, to shed its light. And when the light hits the lotus flowers blossom. So the Buddha wants to find those people or beings who are like the lotus flowers on the surface of the water, just ready to blossom, will be able to understand the Dhamma quickly. This would be people who say in past lives have done meritorious deeds and who have cultivated quite vigorously in this life, so they already have very strong faculties of energy, samadhi, concentration, and this urge to understand the truth and to gain liberation. Okay, so then, as soon as that question comes into the Buddha's mind, then the sort of thought occurs to him, Alara Kalama is wise, intelligent, and discerning. He has long had a little dust in their eyes. Okay, Okay, so this is like a very key phrase, having a little dust in one's eyes. This goes back actually to the time when the Buddha was surveying the world with the eye of a Buddha. Just a few paragraphs, about a paragraph up, we see that the Buddha said, after surveying the world with the eye of the Buddha, he says, I saw beings with little dust in their eyes and with much dust in their eyes. Okay, so Alara Kalama is one who has long had little dust in his eyes. Then he thinks, suppose I taught the Dhamma first to Alara Kalama. He will understand it quickly. Okay, now what is being conveyed in this passage? As I said last week, usually if we look deeply into the suttas, we can see that some kind of message is being conveyed. And so, the way I see it, there's a certain message being conveyed in this passage right here. Not simply the words on the surface, but something else is underlying this. What might it be? Any ideas?
Maybe you want to show gratitude.
Exactly. Yeah, he wants to show gratitude because who is Alara Kalama?
His teacher.
His first meditation teacher. And so he wants to repay almost the debt of gratitude. And so he thinks, let me go to my first teacher and share the Dhamma with him. Okay, so then when this thought comes to his mind, then deities approach him and say, Venerable Sir, Bhante, Alara Kalama died 7 days ago. And then within his own mind, the knowledge arises that Alara Kalama died 7 days ago. So then he thinks that Alara Kalama has lost a great, potentially a great benefit. If he had heard the Dhamma, he would have understood it quickly. So then he thinks, he again considers to whom should I teach the Dhamma? And then who should he think of but Uddaka Ramaputta. And who was Uddaka Ramaputta? You remember?
His second teacher.
It was the second meditation teacher. Okay, so then he thinks, okay, let me teach the Dhamma to Uddaka Ramaputta. He will understand it quickly. But then when that thought comes to him, then the text says, deities approached me and said, Venerable Sir, Uddaka Ramaputta died last night. And then the knowledge and vision arose in me. Uddaka Ramaputta died last night. And then the same thing, that Uddaka Ramaputta has missed out on a great benefit. Doesn't it seem a little peculiar that, he's been practicing meditation in the forest for 6 years, 7 years, 6 years, and, all of this time, these two teachers are alive, and suddenly, actually, he would have reached his enlightenment, according to some texts, 7 weeks earlier, according to other texts, 4 weeks earlier. So at the time he reached enlightenment, his teachers were still alive. If he had gone to teach them immediately after, he could have met them. It's a bit peculiar, I have to say, that one teacher dies 2 weeks earlier and the other teacher dies just the night before. A little bit of a suspicious coincidence. Any significance in that? Of course, it could simply be historical fact.
I want to say Mara got rid of him.
Yeah.
What confuses me is that even though they might have died, I would imagine you can still reach them.
Excuse me?
What confuses me is that even though they might have died,
Yeah.
you could still reach them.
Well, actually not. Even though they died, you see, they had each mastered the arupa meditations, the formless meditative attainments. And because of that mastery, they would have been reborn in formless realms. So they have no physical body, no physical sense organs. And so they have no way of, I mean, this is getting a little bit beyond my sphere of competence, but, you know, this and learning to use an iPod are both a little beyond my sphere of competence. But they don't have any sense faculties, any physical body. And so the Buddha can teach the beings in the ordinary Deva worlds, the Brahma worlds, but in the formless worlds, they don't have ears, so they can't hear him. They don't have eyes, they can't see him, he can't see them.
Is it more reason for him to teach because these teachers are gone now?
Maybe. I don't have an answer to this, it just strikes me as puzzling. It could, of course, be simple coincidence, simple historical fact. Or it could be a way, maybe, of saying, this is just a guess, that like the old dispensations are now passing out. This is the time for the new dispensation to arise.
Could it be Mara's retaliation?
No, it doesn't say anything about Mara causing their death. Okay, anyway, we go back to the text. Okay, so again he's pondering the question, who should I teach first? And now, if you, I think it was mentioned in 36 Sutta, that there were the 5 ascetics who were attending upon the Buddha, thinking that he is the one who's striving most vigorously. And so if anybody is going to reach enlightenment, it's going to be this prince of the second clan. But then when the Buddha started to take, when he gave up on the extreme ascetic practices and started to take food again and to regain his physical strength, then they became disillusioned with the Buddha. They thought that he had returned to a life of luxury, and so they abandoned him. So now the Buddha occurs to him, the bhikkhus of the group of 5 who attended upon me while I was engaged in my striving were very helpful. So again, now it's that thought of, you see, the thought of gratitude is coming up. Suppose I teach the Dhamma first to them. Okay, so then he makes that decision. And maybe you're expecting, deities came to me and told me the bhikkhus of the group of 5 were killed in an automobile accident this morning. But not like that. He finds with his divine eye, he sees that these 5 ascetics are now living near Benares in the deer park at Isipatana. This is a place, today it's called Sarnath. Okay, so now the Buddha, perhaps he spends a little more time around the Bodhi tree at Uruvela, and then it says that he sets out to wander by stages to Benares. And so now he's walking between Bodh Gaya and Benares. I think I once looked it on the map to see what the distance is. I think it's about 200 miles. So if one walks 20 miles a day, one could do it in 10 days. If one goes at a more leisurely pace, maybe 15 days. We have to remember the Buddhist tradition places the day of the Buddha's enlightenment on the full moon of the month Vaisakha, which is, on our calendar, it's about the full moon of May. And they put the date of the first discourse, the full moon of July. So that's 2 months. If the Buddha spent 7 weeks around the Bodhi tree, then he has 1 week to get to Benares. So he should be walking, if it's 200 miles, about 25 to 30 miles a day. Okay, so now as he's walking along this trail to Benares, he comes across an ascetic called Upaka. His name is Upaka, who belongs to a sect called the Ajivakas. The Ajivakas were a school of ascetics that existed contemporaneously with Buddhism. And they actually continue to exist in India, I think based in South India, up to a pretty late period, I think the 14th century of the Common Era. And this was a sect founded by one of the rival teachers of the Buddha, whose name was Makkhali Gosala. And this sect was closely related to the Jains. The founder of the Jains, Mahavira, and the founder of the Ajivakas, Makkhali Gosala, before their respective enlightenments, had been friends who had been practicing, striving together. And then they had some quarrel and they went their separate ways. And then each founded a school, a religious school, which each of those schools continued in India, perhaps even longer than Buddhism did. Okay, so Upaka sees the Buddha on the road and says, "Your faculties are clear, the color of your skin is pure and bright." So he sees that the Buddha, as he's walking along, is very serene. Probably his skin has a bright glow to it. Of course, it's still sort of basking in the afterglow of his enlightenment experience. And then he asks him, "Under whom have you gone forth, friend? Who is your teacher? And whose Dhamma do you proclaim?" Like, this was the standard question that ascetics would ask one another when they would meet out on the open road in India. They would always assume that the person they're meeting was a student of another teacher. And especially now, even according to the canon, the Buddha at this time is just 35 years old. See, Evan, how old? You're about 39?
38, yeah.
38?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, suppose 3 years ago I met you. You're 35 years old, and you're the fully enlightened Buddha. And I say, from my perspective, it's a kid, young man. And he says, "I'm the Buddha." No, I say, "Who's your teacher?" He says, "I have no teacher, I'm the Buddha." So I can't believe it, right? So Upaka, he assumes, he sees this relatively young man, 35 years old, walking along. And so he assumes that he's still a student under the guidance of a teacher. So he asks him, "Who is your teacher?" And then the Buddha replies to him, probably whether the Buddha actually replied in verse, that I don't know. It could be that the Buddha gave a prose statement, and then the compilers of the canon, in order to give more oomph to the statement, to make it more impressive, they versified it. Okay, Okay, and so the Buddha speaks, if it was an ordinary person speaking, it would sound rather boastful, pompous, but this is one who's completely free from any kind of inner sense of self. So from his perspective, he's just really describing his own situation objectively. So he says, I am one who has transcended all, a knower of all, unsullied or unstained among all dhammas, all things, renouncing all. By cravings ceasing, I am freed, having known this all for myself. To whom should I point as a teacher? I have no teacher, and one like me exists nowhere in all the world. First glance, it really seems like boastful to be making statements like that at a superficial level. So, one like me exists nowhere in all the world with all its gods, because I have no person for my counterpart. I am the accomplished one. This is the Arahat in the world. I am the teacher supreme. I alone am a Samasa Buddha, a fully enlightened one, whose fires are quenched and extinguished. I go now to the city of Kasi. Kasi is the state in which Benares was located. So I go now to the city of Kasi to set in motion the Dhammacakka, the wheel of Dharma. In a world that has become blind, I go to beat the drum of the deathless. So the Buddha is making these very bold statements, and then when Upaka hears them, he says, by your claims, friend, you ought to be the universal or infinite victor or conqueror. He uses a word, an expression. I think it occurs only in this passage in Pali. Yeah, the word Jina means conqueror. And this was the designation given to the founder of Jainism. In fact, the word Jain means a follower of the Jina, the conqueror. And then Ananta means infinite. So he's saying, by your claims, you should be the infinite conqueror or the conqueror of the infinite. Perhaps he even thought that the Buddha was, he might have thought that the Buddha is Mahavira, the founder of Jainism. And so there were actually these several words sort of floating around in India at the time of the Buddha to designate the fully accomplished person. One word was Arahat, another word was Buddha, another word was Jina. And so Buddhism took over the word Buddha, Jainism took over the word Jina, and both systems use the word Arahat. So the Jains also go, like one of their salutations, their main salutation, goes something like Namo Chinanam, Namo Siddhanam, Namo Arahatanam. homage to the conquerors, homage to the perfected ones, homage to the arhats. Okay, in Buddhism too, it uses the terminology of, it's the kind of military terminology, the terminology of victor, the victor in battle, the one who has achieved victory in battle. But the Buddhists, they don't use the word, normally they don't use the word jina for the Buddha. Okay, so when Upaka asks that question, then the Buddha says, the victors are those like me who have won the destruction of the asaras, the taints. I have vanquished all papaka dhamma, all evil states, all bad qualities, all the defilements. Therefore, Upaka, I am the jina, the victor, the victorious one. Okay, now one would think that with utterances like this Upaka would bow down and say, so it is, Lord, I go for refuge to the Buddha and to the Dhamma. At present there's no Sangha. But instead, the Buddha's first experience and teaching is a disappointing one. This Ajivaka named Upaka shakes his head and says, may it be so, friend. Then he takes another road and walks off to follow his own destiny. According to the commentary, his destiny actually eventually brought him back to the Buddha. Okay, what happened to Upaka? He left the Buddha, he went off, perhaps again continuing on his own, his meditations, his ascetic practices, until one day he encountered someplace in the woods the beautiful daughter of a hunter. And maybe she came to offer him food, I don't remember the details, but he saw her and he was taken with her, struck with her, and fell in love with her. And then he gave up his ascetic life and he told her that he wanted to marry her. She said, if you want to marry me, you have to ask my father. So he went to the father and said, I want to marry your daughter. The father said, are you willing to, if you want to marry my daughter, you have to take up the trade of a hunter. And here is a man who's been living an ascetic, non-violent life. But maybe this is the way the commentary is trying to suggest the intoxicating effect of sensual love. So he says, yes, I will take up the craft of a hunter. The father teaches him how to hunt animals, and then he becomes a hunter. Then in time, his wife gets pregnant, gives birth to a little boy. The little boy starts to grow till he's a few years old. And then one day, the father is taking care of the little boy, and then the mother sees what the father is looking after the boy wrongly. And then the mother starts, his wife starts yelling at him and ridiculing him and teasing him, saying, my husband used to be an ascetic, but he was hit by Cupid's arrow and fell from his lofty life. And now he doesn't even know how to take care of his own child. Then he thought, oh my heavens, instead of like he woke up out of this bad dream and thought, what have I done to myself? I was living a very pure, contemplative life, striving for enlightenment, and here I am, married to this terrible woman who's always teasing me, taunting me, yelling at me, living in this household of a hunter, working as a hunter myself. how did I ever fall so low? I have to go back and live the ascetic life. And then he thought, who should I take as my teacher? Then he remembered several years earlier, he had encountered on the road between Gaya and Benares a man who called himself the infinite conqueror, and he had been so impressed by this person, so impressed by his statement, he thought, that must be the person who I should take as my teacher. And so then he went walking all over this area in northern India, asking about the person that they call the conqueror of the infinite conqueror, till his inquiries eventually led him back to the Buddha. He met the Buddha, became a monk, and then he became eventually an Arhat. And then his wife and child also eventually came to the Buddha, and they became respectively a nun and a monk, and they also achieved enlightenment and became Arhats. Okay, so now the Buddha, gradually walking in the direction of Benares, he comes to the deer park, and he's in the distance. The 5 ascetics are at their headquarters, and in the distance they see the Buddha coming. So the text says, the bhikkhus saw me coming in the distance, and now they make an agreement amongst themselves. They say, here comes the ascetic Gautama, who lives luxuriously, who gave up his striving, his effort, and he returned to a life of luxury. We should not pay homage to him. Earlier, they regarded him as the teacher, and so they would pay homage to him. We should not rise up for him. That's a gesture of politeness. Or take his bowl and outer robe. That would be sign of respect and cordiality. But they say that we can prepare a seat for him, and if he wants to, he can sit down and join us. You know, they'll allow him to join the group, but they no longer want to regard him as their leader or teacher. Okay, and so they prepare the seat for him, but as the Buddha approaches closer, then these monks are not able to keep their pact. So one of them gets up and goes out on the road to meet him, to take his bowl and his extra robe. Another prepares the seat. Another sets out water for him to wash his feet. But they continued to address him by the name, or by the title, Avuso Gautama. The word avuso, it doesn't quite mean friend. It's a term, it's a kind of mixture of respect and friendliness. It's the term that would be used amongst the ascetics, or even between people in society. It's a term which is used between equals. So the word is avuso. And then the other word used is Bhante. Okay, so they're addressing him as Avuso Gautama. And when they address him in that way, then the Buddha says, do not address the Tathagata by name and as friend, or avuso. The Tathagata is an accomplished one, it's an Arahat, a fully enlightened one, Sammasambuddha. And then he announces his attainment. He says, the deathless has been attained. I shall instruct you, teach you the Dhamma. Practicing as you are instructed, you yourselves will realize here and now through direct knowledge the supreme goal of the holy life, for the sake of which you have gone forth into homelessness. Okay, so the Buddha is sort of inviting them to partake of the feast, to listen to his teaching, to accept it, and by accepting it, to undertake the practice. And he's assuring them that they could reach the same deathless, the realization of the deathless that he himself has achieved. But the monks won't go in for this, because they're still convinced that the way to enlightenment, the way to liberation, is through the ascetic practices. And so they continue to use the word friend Gautama. They say, friend Gautama, by the conduct, the practice, the performance of austerities, the self-mortification, the difficult practices that you undertook, you didn't achieve any superhuman states, any of the noble realizations of wisdom. But now look at you. They might be themselves are pretty much reduced to skin and bone. The ribs are showing through their skin. They have that fierce expression in their eyes, the fierce look of the true ascetic. And the Buddha is maybe quite, say, well-fed, a little bit plump, bright, shiny features. And so they're pointing to him and saying, you're now living, look at you, you're living luxuriously, self-indulgent, eating solid meals. We're just eating, just a handful of rice every day. You've given up your fast. We're fasting 2 days a week. You're sleeping on a bed of leaves. We're sleeping on a bed of thorns. So you've reverted to luxury. So how could you achieve any kind of superhuman state? How could you make this claim? Ridiculous. But now the Buddha tells them, he says, the Tathagata, he's always referring to himself almost from an impersonal point of view, not saying I, but using the expression the Tathagata. The Tathagata does not live luxuriously, nor has he given up his striving and reverted to luxury. Then he repeats the claim that he is now the Arahat, the Buddha, the enlightened one. I'll teach you the deathless. So this goes on 3 times through paragraph 27, till now the Buddha takes a different tack. He says to them, bhikkhus, have you ever known me to speak like this before? And when the Buddha raises this question, the monks must have realized that the Buddha was always perfectly straightforward, perfectly sincere. He had the kind of character that would never make any false claims to attainment. And so now they reply to him. They don't say, no, Avuso Gautama, but they say, no hate tongue, I think it's no hate tongue, Bhante, which is now they're changing the address from Avuso to Bhante, which is like Venerable Sir. So they say, no, Venerable Sir. So now the Buddha again repeats his claim that he can teach them the deathless, that they can reach the goal of the spiritual life. And now with this, now when the monks say, no, Bhante, that indicates something significant. What does it indicate?
they see him as a teacher.
Right. Now, just by asking that question, their point of view has changed. Their attitude has completely changed. So it's just indicated very subtly in the text by a change in the form of address. But by using this new address, no Bhante, it shows that now they are looking to him as the teacher. And so he says, I was able to convince the group of 5 bhikkhus. Okay, then he would go on. Actually, at this point, so this text doesn't present it in that way, but if you go to the first discourse of the Buddha, which begins with the Buddha saying to the monks, there are, O monks, these 2 extremes which should be avoided by one who has gone forth from the world. What are the 2? One is the indulgence in a life of sensual pleasures. The other is the practice of self-mortification. So at that point, the Buddha begins his first sermon, the first discourse, turning the wheel of the Dhamma. And then at the end of the turning of the wheel of the Dhamma, or at the end of the first discourse, then one of the 5 monks named Kandanyo gains the vision of the Dhamma, or the eye of the Dhamma. He sees into the 4 Noble Truths, and with that he reaches the first stage of enlightenment. He becomes a Sotapanna. Okay, then after that, the Buddha continues to instruct the group of monks. And so it's really at that point, after the first discourse, that the Buddha and the 5 monks are now living together for an extended period. And so they have to eat every day, and so they made a kind of agreement. The Buddha stays and teaches, but now since the monks are now his disciples, sometimes 3 of them will go out on alms round and the Buddha will instruct 2. On other times 2 will go out on the alms round and bring back the food, and the Buddha will instruct the other 3. Okay, and so the 6 of them would live on the food that was brought back by either 3 monks or 2 monks. And this goes on for a period, I believe it's 1 week or 5 days, until at the end of that, first the Buddha gives the discourse on the 4 Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. That is the turning of the wheel of Dharma. Then somehow, according to the narrative in the text, the second formal discourse that the Buddha gave to all 5 monks together is the discourse on non-self. That's called the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, which comes in the Samyutta Nikaya. And at the end of the discourse on non-self, all 5 monks achieve arahantship. But somehow it said that the Buddha was giving instructions to the monks between the first discourse on the 4 Noble Truths, the second discourse on the characteristic of non-self. So what kind of discourses did the Buddha give? What kind of instructions did he give between these 2 formal discourses? What do you think?
Satipatthana.
Anybody else? But the Satipatthana discourse, it said, was given when the Buddha was living at the Kuru country, which is quite far away from Benares.
Or imagine him giving them like short instructions on what to do, how to meditate.
Okay, that's a good idea, yeah. Yeah, I think probably it was just practical meditation instructions. But I don't think it would be the formal Satipatthana Sutta, but probably just individual meditation instructions, so that they're able to undertake the practice to sort of build up, strengthen their faculties to attain arhatship. Okay, so now at this point where paragraph 30 begins, this will be probably the occasion after the discourse on non-self where they reach arhatship. So now he says, thus then the bhikkhus of the group of 5, thus taught and instructed by me, being themselves subject to birth, having understood the danger in what is subject to birth, seeking the unborn supreme security from bondage, nibbana, attain the unborn supreme security from bondage, nibbana. Similarly, being subject to aging, sickness, death, sorrow, and defilement, they attain the undefiled supreme security from bondage, nibbana. The knowledge and vision arose in them. Our deliverance, our liberation is unshakable. This is our last birth. There is no renewal of being, no more continued becoming. Okay, so now at this point the Buddha has completed the narrative of his own search for enlightenment, his attainment of enlightenment, his decision to teach, his first teaching, and the fulfillment of his teaching by liberating the first disciples from birth and death. And now, maybe at this point I'll ask whether there's any questions on anything that we've covered so far. Okay, there's an internet question. Okay, in the canon we find a lot of things which may not be right. Isn't that a violation of one of the most fundamental aspects of right speech? I was wondering how the people following the path could have added such things. I have to say I've wondered about that too, particularly some of the accounts. I mean, what strikes me is some of the way the Buddhist texts report on interactions between the Buddhists and the Jains, where they make the Jains appear foolish, incompetent, deceitful, proud, ambitious, deluded. And I'm sure that from the perspective of the Jains, they were not in such a situation themselves by any means. Okay, I don't know the explanation. Sometimes I guess feelings of rivalry between sects could motivate people to such an extent that they would misrepresent the positions of others. Okay, any further questions? Yeah, forward. If there is the other microphone.
The first discourse is about the Four Noble Truths
Yeah.
and Noble Eightfold Path, and the second one is about the 3 characteristics. But I remember when we were studying the Buddha's words, you said before the Four Noble Truths one has to understand the 3 characteristics.
Yeah.
So obviously one can skip that stage and go to Four Noble Truths first, and then attend the stream entry. After that,
Yeah.
the stream entry to Ariyapariyesana, then works on the 3 characteristics.
That's a very good point. Okay, this is the way I would understand it. I would say that the faculties of these 5 disciples were probably very mature, so that as soon as they heard the 4 Noble Truths, then they were able to have an immediate breakthrough to the first level of enlightenment. But in their case, then, to progress further, they would have to contemplate, and understand the three characteristics. That becomes the means for completely releasing the mind from the defilements. In other words, for reaching arhatship. But within the normal sequence of meditative development, one would begin, I mean not at the very beginning, but one would proceed through contemplation of the three characteristics, and then there's the contemplation of the three characteristics that leads to insight knowledge. It's called vipassana jnana, the knowledge or wisdom of insight. And it's when the knowledge of insight reaches its fulfillment, its culmination, that it brings the breakthrough to the supramundane realization, which is the realization of the Four Noble Truths. But there are cases of some people who, with very mature faculties, would be able to make that initial breakthrough simply by getting the fundamental principle of the Four Noble Truths. For example, there's a story that comes, it's actually preserved in the Vinaya Pitaka, about the first realization of Sariputta, when he and his friend Moggallana, they had traveled, they were boyhood friends, that when they renounced, they always traveled together throughout India, seeking a teacher who could guide them to enlightenment. And then finally they saw one of these first 5 arahats, the monk named Assaji. And the first one to see him was Sariputta, and Sariputta was very impressed by him. He went to him, asked him, who is your teacher, and so on. Assaji said, my teacher is the sage Gautama from the Sakyan clan, the one they call the Buddha. Then Sariputta said, what is his teaching? Tell me the teaching. Then Assaji said, the teaching is very difficult, very deep. I'm just a beginner, I don't know it very well. But Sariputta said, just tell me the essence. And then Assaji